Welcome back to Drennan Live here on SportsTime Ohio. NFL season right around the corner. We're in camp now, but it means fantasy football. I know a lot of you are very excited about that, and I'm very pleased to have with us right now Ryan Fowler from FoxSports.com. He covers all the fantasy sports for them, and I think we'll all be experts now, right, Ryan, after we hear from you and who we should draft, right?
Well, that's the goal. I don't think I'm doing my job if you guys aren't a little bit smarter after this segment.
First off, just draft strategies. Let's talk that. And how can the fans go about it? What's your keys to a successful fantasy football draft?
Yeah, well, I guess it starts with what type of league you have. Are you in a standard league or are you in a points per reception league? That means every time your running back or wide receiver or tight end catches a pass, are you getting that extra point? So most leagues are going PPR because it is such a pass-friendly league right now. So when you're looking at that strategy, I think a lot of wide receivers are coming off the board. You look at something called ADP, average draft position, and I mean, you got Antonio Brown up there, you got Julio Jones, Odell Beckham, Dez Bryant, the cast of characters that you've heard years past. And it's because it's so pass friendly, more wide receivers are being drafted in the first and second rounds, and that also has to do with a lot of running backs, including the one there in Cleveland, going with committees in the backfield.
Yeah, the Fox Fantasy team coming out with their top 200, and I was just going to ask you, you see a lot of the receivers now in the top as opposed to previous years where it would have been that running back position. So, a lot of people needing now to take, obviously, that receiver higher up than they normally would have, right?
Yeah, I mean, Antonio Brown over the last 2, maybe 3 years has been a top 2 pick, and now he's really kind of just pushed his way to the front. And a lot of that has to do with Le'Veon Bell's suspension and Martavis Bryant being out for the season there in Pittsburgh. But Antonio Brown, I mean, you really don't get too much consistency better than Antonio Brown, maybe Julio Jones on any given season. But Roethlisberger and Brown, they work well together. And then Matt Ryan and Julio Jones, they work well together. We've seen what Odell Beckham's been able to do in his first season and a half. And then Dez Bryant's coming back from injury. Jordy Nelson returns for the Green Bay Packers. And again, it's just one of those things where because the game has shifted so much to the air and you have such quality quarterbacks that are working with these top-tier receivers, you're looking for consistency, and that comes in wide receivers more so than running backs these days.
Well, here on the Browns, Josh Gordon will serve that first 4-game suspension, but then we'll be back. I mean, what do you think about him, and is he worth, a pick or a pickup?
Yeah, I think he's a golden ticket right now. I think we have to wait and see how this offense works because, again, there's a lot of moving parts. You have a new head coach. You have RG3, probably the starter, not a lock yet, but probably the starter by the start of the season. You bring in Corey Coleman, a rookie slot receiver. So the one thing that I want everybody to remember about Josh Gordon as it pertains to fantasy football, when he was going off in those first few years, Jason Campbell was his quarterback. So it's not like, and they were playing in garbage time and in a lot of prevent defenses that allowed Gordon to kind of run wild. But I mean, he was putting up astronomical numbers. So I think he's worthy of a late round flyer. I just wouldn't invest too heavily just because of the name recognition. And you also have to remember you don't get him until October. But I don't think it really matters the quarterback behind center. Gordon is a talent. And if he can, again, stay clean off the field, I really think that there is a high ceiling for him, even though there are all these moving parts.
I had Gary Barnidge on my team last year. He got me some good points. How do you think about the Browns tight end this year?
Yeah, I like him. I think I liked him a little bit more last year because, again, we talk about those variables changing. It's a new quarterback. Barnidge did a lot of work with McCown and Manziel last year. And when you change to a different head coach and you change to a mobile quarterback that can call his own number, I think that also impacts how they use Gary this year. That's not to say that he couldn't go out there and put up some points, but I think he's lost some value year over year because of Hugh Jackson's arrival, and Hugh does like to use the running backs a little bit more. And then, of course, RG3, the assumed starter by week 1.
So you talk running backs, very important as well. Obviously, if you have those receivers coming off, you switch to running back. Then let's say looking at Isaiah Crowell, a Duke Johnson, do you see them up there at all?
Well, I think you're going to, and again, this goes back to the committee thing I mentioned earlier, where you have these split carries, and Hugh Jackson's coming from Cincinnati, where you had Jeremy Hill and you had Gio Bernard, and yet they were able to coexist. I think Jeremy Hill kind of created a little bit more of a gap last year ahead of Gio Bernard, but again, this is where variables come into play. I hate to sound like a broken record, but we know what happened with Crowell off the field with the social media posts, so we have to see how that impacts anything. But I do like Duke Johnson in PPR. I really think Duke Johnson in PPR leagues in that 6th, 7th round, that could be some good value because, again, a lot of fantasy owners, and you also have to know who you're playing with. If most of the guys in your league are Cleveland Browns fans, you probably have some tendency to actually look at the Cleveland Browns, whereas if you're playing with guys from all over the country, people kind of pump the brakes and say, I'll take Corey Coleman and maybe a dash of Barnage and hold off on the running backs. But I really think Duke Johnson in that 6th, 7th round in PPR leagues, there is something to be interested about there because of Hugh Jackson's arrival.
Lastly, just on the Browns here, looking at this, RG3, we mentioned, obviously we're assuming he will be the starter. We don't know that for sure yet, but we're assuming that, okay? So do you take a flyer on him? And Terrell Pryor, is he even on the radar at all for you?
Those are loaded questions, and it's going to get me in trouble with your audience. But let's kind of be realistic with RG3. I think when you're looking at a fantasy football league, you're starting 12 quarterbacks, and in some leagues you get to start 2, and then you get into the 24 range. Maybe a low-end QB2 would be RG3's of the moment value, only because what have you done for me lately, right? I mean, you go back to his rookie year, he did some great things, but out of sight, out of mind. It's hard to really put a value on RG3 without any real game footage, new offense, new coach. But you have to like Coleman and Gordon come October if RG3 is behind center. There's a lot that can be liked then. I just wouldn't go crazy in draft season to say RG3 is going to pick up where he left off his rookie season when all those great numbers were coming out. And then as far as Terrell Pryor, go Bucks, but I'm going to pump the brakes on that.
All right, thank you. Like it. You mentioned Le'Veon Bell and the suspension. What impact is that going to have now on the draft for people?
Yeah, well, I just finished a mock draft with some guys at foxsports.com/fantasy. And this is kind of how the conversation ended. Somebody drafted Le'Veon Bell and D'Angelo Williams and wondered about that strategy. And I go, you're going to have a headache when October rolls around because Le'Veon Bell's coming off a serious leg injury with multiple ligaments popped here and there. And then you have the suspension on top of it. He was suspended for 2 games last year. And D'Angelo Williams did a lot of great things last year for the Steelers, especially around the end zone. So once they get inside the 10, once they get into the 5, is this another committee? Because D'Angelo Williams did a lot of good things in Carolina as part of a committee with him and John Stewart for years. Now he goes to Pittsburgh, and is he going to bump Le'Veon Bell out of the way? That's why a month ago you would have asked me, what do I think about Le'Veon Bell? I'm like, top 2 pick. No. And then I started to think, okay, you add the suspension in, you look at what D'Angelo Williams was able to do when Bell was out and on IR last year. That's a little bit of a quagmire that I don't think too many people are looking at, where D'Angelo Williams in September could create a little bit more of a time split once Bell returns from not only suspension, but he's also coming back from a major injury. Something to keep in mind when you come up with your draft strategy.
And, of course, you have to talk about the quarterback. I get very quarterback happy in my league.
Sure.
I like to just have him there just in case. But, you look at Tom Brady being suspended, so where that puts the quarterbacks then in line after, when he's suspended for those first games.
Yeah, my strategy when it comes to quarterbacks, I think there is so much risk that comes with running backs that in the first 4 rounds, I address the running back and wide receiver need. And then there are enough talented quarterbacks in the first 12 quarterback rankings to look at them in the 5th, 6th, and 7th round. I mean, I've been able to pick up guys like Tony Romo and, plug your ears, Cleveland, Ben Roethlisberger in the 6th and 7th rounds in previous drafts. I don't think I'm going to get that type of value out of Roethlisberger this year. But as far as Tom Brady goes, 4 weeks is 4 weeks. And the one thing that I want everybody to know about Tom Brady is I owned him in 3 leagues last year. I took a flyer on him in the 9th or 10th rounds when everybody thought he was going to be suspended last September. And his first half of the season splits were 20-plus fantasy points per game. Great production. Then in the second half, he fell below 20 fantasy points per game. And then in the fantasy playoffs, Tom Brady only averaged 16 fantasy points per game. So Tom Brady, he has so many weapons around him with Gronk. They bring in Martellus Bennett. They got Julian Edelman. They've gotten Dion Lewis back. There's a lot to like about Tom Brady. There was a lot to like about Tom Brady last year, and then it didn't really work out in the playoffs. So don't go crazy on Tom Brady. I think with the suspension, 6th or 7th round is probably where you're going to want to look at. In the mock that we just did, he went in the 8th round. So that's kind of where we're at with Tom Brady right now.
So I see in the top 200 list as that top quarterback sitting here, you guys have Cam Newton. So is that really just what you go with? Cam Newton's your guy. Also, do you pick his biggest weapon and try to target that as well? And how important is it to do the combos like that with the QB and their top receiver, let's say?
Yeah, I think it depends on the team as far as the tandems go. I really think Fitzpatrick and Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker are among the best trios in the game, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to go crazy and draft Ryan Fitzpatrick early because Marshall and Decker, from a consistency standpoint, they're going to put up some points there with Fitz behind center. I have no doubt that they're not going to regress year over year. As far as Cam Newton goes, I think because he calls his own number, that's where the value comes from, and that's why there is that allure, because he's going to pick up the rushing touchdowns and rushing yards on top of everything else. He gets Kelvin Benjamin back this year, but I really think that the Benjamin-Greg Olsen coexist situation is going to be the one to kind of pay attention to. Greg Olsen's one of the most consistent fantasy tight ends in the league, and that's why I think Greg Olsen in the 4th round is probably where you're going to have to get him. I don't think he's going to fall any further than the 4th round. So it's just something to keep in mind there. And then as far as other tandems to keep an eye on, Aaron Rodgers, Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, big fan of that. And then the one that not a lot of people are talking about, I might be on an island about this, but Carson Palmer and Michael Floyd did a lot of great things down the stretch last year. Michael Floyd out of Notre Dame. He missed the start of the season last year, but he finished strong in December. So that's another tandem that I'm definitely looking at, where Carson Palmer is among the top 5 quarterbacks coming off the board.
I hope everybody was taking notes. There was a lot of info, very, very knowledgeable. You can follow him at Fox Sports Fowler, and you, the fans, can actually send in questions. We'll do this weekly here on Drennan Live, and you can see, who you should draft, what positions are you worried about, wondering about. So we'll have all of that. So thanks so much, Ryan, for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care. Calls coming up next right here on Drennan Live. Make sure you reserve your spot, 844-289-1421. That's all next right here on SportsTime Ohio. Drennan Live is brought to you by your Northern Ohio Hyundai dealers. Visit buyhyundai.com.